When did you realize there was something up with your best friend? A few weeks ago, my best friend Courtney called me sobbing. I lost my baby Kate. Exactly 10 weeks again. My stomach dropped. Courtney had miscarried 4 times now, all at precisely 10 weeks. I'm a nurse practitioner. That timing pattern doesn't occur naturally. I drove straight to her house where her husband Joe answered, looking exhausted. She's resting. This one hit her hard. I need to see her. Maybe tomorrow. Joe, I'm her best friend and I'm a nurse. Let me help. He reluctantly let me in. Courtney was in bed, pale and groggy. When I hugged her, I noticed bruising on her inner arm. Fresh needle marks, multiple injection sites. Courtney, these marks. She looked confused. I don't remember getting any shots. I woke up with them after I blacked out last night. You blacked out? Joe interrupted us from the doorway. She faints sometimes. Stress from the pregnancy. 3 days later, Courtney was feeling better and we met for coffee. I've been thinking, she said. I never actually saw my regular OBGYN during any of my pregnancies. Joe always said he found better specialists. That seemed wrong. Dr. Holly? You've seen her for years. Joe said she was too busy. He'd take me to appointments, but I'd always feel so drowsy in the waiting room. He'd go in to talk to the doctor while I rested in the car. I called Dr. Holly's office that afternoon, pretending to be Courtney checking on my records. I need to verify my appointment history for insurance. Miss Roberts? Our records show you called to transfer your care elsewhere last year, and the year before, always after positive pregnancy tests. That evening, Courtney texted me again. Found something weird. Joe keeps a detailed calendar in his phone. It has all my periods marked, and there are red X's exactly 14 days after each period starts, going back 3 years. 14 days after period starts is ovulation. Peak fertility. Courtney, does anything happen on the red X days? She thought about it. Around then is when Joe makes me tea, I guess. He says it's good for sleep and fertility. I always take it because I'm usually tired and we want to start a family. I was so suspicious that the next day, I came over the next day while Joe was at work. That's when Courtney showed me something else. I found this tiny safe in his closet, like the kind doctors use for medications, but it's locked. We tried every code we could think of, but nothing worked. Courtney, think. Those nights he gives you the tea, what happens after? She went pale. I always wake up feeling sore. Down there. Joe says we tried for a baby, but I never remember it. My stomach turned. He was drugging her and assaulting her on her fertile days to get her pregnant. Oh my God. Could the miscarriages be him? She shot out. I thought back to my medical training. Courtney, does anything weird happen before each miscarriage? Any sort of pattern? She thought about it for a while. Now that I think about it, I get really sick days before each one. Way more sick than usual. Her eyes went wide. Joe makes me soup. Some special recipe he says helps with morning sickness. Every single time. Every time, she yelled. He's insistent I eat it all. We went back to the safe. Courtney remembered something. His ex-girlfriend's name was Marie. Her birthday was October 15th. The safe clicked open. Inside were vials of medications. 2 types. One labeled with a fertility drug code. The other, mifepristone, I whispered. Abortion medication. But there was more. A journal documenting everything. Dates, doses, termination schedules. 4 completed cycles. A 5th planned. The last entry was yesterday. S successfully terminated pregnancy number 4. Increase fertility dose next cycle. Begin cycle number 5 in 30 days. Courtney was shaking. Why would he do this to me? I found another document. Life insurance policies. Each pregnancy, he'd taken out policies on the unborn child. Each miscarriage paid out $50,000. He'd made $200,000 from forcing her through this torture. We photographed everything. Then Courtney put it back exactly as we'd found it. We went to the police station with the photos. The officer looked bored. Your husband gives you fertility vitamins? That's not illegal. He's drugging me and forcing abortions. These could be your medications. Without proof he's administering them against your will, this is marital dispute. We left devastated. The system wouldn't help. That night, Courtney went home and acted normal. She told Joe she wanted to try for another baby immediately. He was thrilled, said he'd make her special tea tomorrow. I went to a friend who works in toxicology. We tested the tea Courtney had secretly saved from previous nights. Positive for Rohypnol. Date rape drug. The next evening, Courtney wore a wire I'd borrowed from my cop brother. When Joe brought the tea, she pretended to sip it. 20 minutes later, she acted drowsy. Joe carried her to bed. I was listening from my car, ready to call 911. The wire picked up everything. The safe opening, liquid being drawn into a syringe, his footsteps returning. Then the sound of him moving the bed sheets, checking her pulse, lifting her eyelid and letting it drop. Joe? Courtney's voice fully alert. What's in the syringe? Silence. Then scrambling sounds. The wire picked up a crash and Courtney's scream, then Joe's voice saying something I couldn't make out through the static. I was already dialing 911 while jumping out of my car and running toward their house. My phone pressed to my ear as I told the dispatcher there was a domestic violence incident happening right now at the address. Through the wire I heard another crash, definitely glass breaking this time, and Courtney yelling for Joe to get away from her. My legs pumped harder as I sprinted up their driveway, the dispatcher asking questions I barely registered while the sounds from the wire got more chaotic. I reached their front door and found it unlocked, throwing it open so hard it slammed against the wall. The scene in the bedroom made my blood run cold. Courtney was backed into the corner by the dresser, holding her arm like it was hurt, while Joe stood between her and the bedroom door, blocking her only way out. He turned to look at me, and his face wasn't the friendly mask I'd known for years, but something cold and calculating that made every hair on my body stand up. The syringe was on the floor near the bed where it must have fallen during their struggle, and there were pieces of the bedside lamp scattered across the carpet. Joe took a step toward me, and I backed up instinctively, keeping myself between him and the front door, while Courtney stayed frozen in the corner. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then we all heard the sirens getting closer, and his whole body went rigid. The police burst through the door less than a minute later, 3 officers with hands on their weapons telling everyone to stay where they were. They separated us immediately, one officer taking Joe to the living room, while another stayed with Courtney, and the third pulled me outside to the porch. Joe's voice carried from inside, all concerned husband now, telling the officers how Courtney had been having mental health problems since her latest miscarriage, and he was just trying to give her the medication her doctor prescribed. The officer with me looked skeptical when I tried to explain what was really happening, but then I remembered the wire and pulled out my phone. I played the recording for him, starting from when Joe brought the tea and Courtney pretended to drink it, through him carrying her unconscious body to bed, the sounds of the safe opening, liquid being drawn into a syringe, and then Courtney's alert voice asking what was in it. The officer's face changed completely as he listened, especially when he heard Joe checking if Courtney was unconscious before preparing the injection. He immediately called for his supervisor and went inside to talk to the other officers. I could see through the window as Courtney showed them the syringe on the bedroom floor, which they carefully picked up with gloves and put in an evidence bag. She was shaking, but her voice was steady as she explained about the drugged tea and how this was the 4th time she'd miscarried at exactly 10 weeks. Joe kept trying to interrupt, calling her delusional and saying she was making things up, but the officers weren't buying it anymore. The supervisor arrived within 15 minutes, an older woman who listened to the recording herself, and then looked at the evidence bag with the syringe. She asked Courtney a few questions about the bruises on her arms and the needle marks, then turned to Joe and told him he was under arrest for assault. The change in Joe was instant and terrifying. The mask dropped completely, and he went totally silent, his eyes flat and emotionless as they read him his rights and put the handcuffs on. He didn't say another word as they led him to the patrol car, just stared at Courtney with this look that made me move protectively closer to her. At the police station, they put Courtney and me in a small interview room where we spent the next 3 hours going through everything we'd discovered. The detective taking our report started out looking bored, like he'd heard it all before, but as we laid out the evidence, his pen started moving faster across his notepad. The wire recording was the key, along with the photos we'd taken of the safe contents, and Joe's journal documenting his termination schedules for each pregnancy. We showed him the calendar screenshots with the red X marks on Courtney's fertile days, the life insurance policies on each unborn child, and the test results showing Rohypnol in the tea. By the time we finished, the detective was calling in other officers and making phone calls to the district attorney's office. They released Joe on bail the next morning, which made both Courtney and me sick with fear. The detective assured us there would be conditions, that Joe couldn't come near Courtney or contact her, but we both knew how useless a piece of paper was against someone that calculating. Courtney couldn't stand being in that house another minute, so she packed a bag with essentials while I stood guard, and we drove straight to my apartment. She barely spoke during the drive, just stared out the window with her arms wrapped around herself. Once we got to my place, we spread everything out on my dining room table and started organizing it properly. The photos of the safe contents went in one folder, the calendar screenshots in another, the journal pages in a third. My hands were shaking as I helped Courtney take new photos of the bruises on her arms and the needle marks that were starting to fade but were still visible. We documented everything we could think of, knowing we'd need every piece of evidence to make sure Joe couldn't talk his way out of this. 2 days later, we had an appointment with Detective Gregory Rivera, who'd been assigned as the lead investigator on the case. He was different from the first detective, younger and more intense, with eyes that didn't miss anything as we walked him through the timeline again. Gregory pulled out a legal pad and started making notes while asking us specific questions about dates and times, and who else might have witnessed anything suspicious. He wanted to know if we had the actual tea Courtney had saved, and I handed him the sealed container I'd brought with me, watching him bag it as evidence and label it with the case number. He explained that building a solid case would take time because they'd need to test the medications from the safe, subpoena financial records from the insurance companies, and track down medical records from whatever fake specialist Joe had been claiming to use. The tea sample would go straight to the crime lab for rush testing, and he gave Courtney a packet about filing for a restraining order, which she filled out right there in his office while I held her shaking hand. That afternoon, we went to the courthouse where a judge granted the emergency order after reading Courtney's statement, and the bailiff told us Joe would be served within 24 hours. We thought that would give us some breathing room, but Joe showed up at my apartment building the very next night, pounding on the security door and yelling for Courtney to come out and talk to him. The building's security cameras caught everything as he tried different codes on the keypad, and then attempted to follow another resident inside before security arrived and made him leave. Gregory added the restraining order violation to Joe's charges when we brought him the security footage the next morning. 3 days later, the lab results came back on the tea, and Gregory called us into the station to discuss them. The report showed Rohypnol in what he called therapeutic doses, carefully measured amounts that would incapacitate someone without causing the memory blackout that higher doses would create. Gregory said this showed careful calculation and planning, not some crime of passion or momentary bad judgment, which would strengthen the prosecution's case. He arranged for Courtney to meet with Esme Greer, a domestic violence advocate who worked with the district attorney's office, and Esme spent 2 hours with us creating a detailed safety plan. She'd seen similar cases before, and warned us that men like Joe often escalate when they start losing control of the situation, so we needed to vary our routines, stay in groups, and document everything. Meanwhile, Gregory got a warrant to search Joe's phone and computer, and the digital forensics team found encrypted files and evidence of dark web purchases going back over a year. They started working to trace how he'd gotten the illegal drugs, following Bitcoin transactions and coded messages through multiple layers of security. About 3 weeks into the investigation, B. Schultz from the crime lab called Gregory with the test results on the medications from Joe's safe. The fertility drugs were black market versions from overseas, dangerously concentrated at levels that could have caused serious complications for Courtney. The abortion pills matched the exact chemical signature of what had caused Courtney's miscarriages, confirming that Joe had been deliberately terminating each pregnancy at 10 weeks. Joe's lawyer started pushing for a plea deal almost immediately, claiming his client had mental health issues and needed treatment, not prison. Renata Wright, the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, told us she wouldn't accept anything less than serious jail time, given the mountain of evidence and the calculated nature of the crimes. During the financial investigation, we discovered Joe had taken out additional insurance policies we hadn't known about, including disability insurance on Courtney that would pay out if she became unable to have children. The policies totaled over $500,000, and he'd been paying the premiums for years, showing this wasn't some recent plan, but something he'd been setting up since before they got married. Courtney started having panic attacks whenever she saw men who looked even slightly like Joe, freezing up in grocery stores or coffee shops when someone with similar hair or build walked by. She began seeing a trauma specialist twice a week, though she told me during one of our late-night talks that she didn't think she'd ever feel truly safe again, not after learning how long Joe had been planning this, and how many times he'd drugged her without her knowing. Gregory kept finding more evidence as the investigation continued, including pharmacy records showing Joe had been getting prescriptions from multiple doctors across 3 different states using various symptoms and complaints. He'd built up his drug supply over years, stockpiling medications and carefully documenting his experiments in coded files on his computer. The forensics team also found searches for lethal doses and drug interactions, suggesting Joe might have been planning to escalate beyond forced miscarriages. We learned he'd been telling coworkers for months that Courtney was becoming unstable and paranoid, laying groundwork to discredit her if she ever figured out what he was doing. Several of his colleagues came forward after his arrest, saying they'd noticed him mentioning Courtney's supposed mental health issues frequently, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Joe had turned Courtney's desire to have children into a twisted money-making scheme, treating her body like an investment opportunity, while pretending to be the supportive husband, desperate for a family. Gregory called me 3 days later saying he'd tracked down Marie, and she'd agreed to talk. I drove Courtney to the station where we met Marie for the first time, a thin woman with nervous hands who kept touching her hair while she talked. She told Gregory about dating Joe for 2 years, how he'd always made her special drinks that made her tired, how she'd get sick after eating his cooking but never connected it until she caught him crushing pills into her wine one night. She'd broken up with him immediately and moved to another state but never reported it because she thought no one would believe her. Gregory recorded everything while Marie described the control patterns, the way Joe would tell everyone she was unstable, how he'd insisted on going to all her doctor appointments just like with Courtney. The pharmacy investigation took weeks, but when the results came back, they were shocking. Joe had been doctor shopping across 3 states for 5 years, complaining about anxiety to one doctor, insomnia to another, chronic pain to a third, building up a supply of controlled substances that he'd never actually taken himself. The records showed he'd filled prescriptions at 27 different pharmacies using slightly different versions of his name, paying cash to avoid insurance tracking. Gregory's team found he'd even created fake medical histories at walk-in clinics, memorizing symptoms to get specific drugs. Then a nurse named Beth called the station after seeing news coverage of Joe's arrest. She'd worked at one of those supposed specialist offices Joe had taken Courtney to, except it wasn't really a specialist office at all, but a general practice clinic. Beth remembered Joe because he'd insisted on being in the exam room during what he claimed were his wife's appointments, but there was never any actual patient, just Joe talking to the doctor while supposedly his wife waited in the car. She'd thought it was strange enough to mention to her supervisor, but nothing came of it. Renata spent hours with us going through all the evidence, building her case piece by piece. She explained that the repeated forced miscarriages weren't just assault but attempted murder because the drugs Joe used could have killed Courtney at any point. The doses he'd been giving her were already dangerous and getting stronger each time according to his journal. She showed us medical reports from experts who said Courtney was lucky to be alive after 4 cycles of those medications. Renata kept finding more charges to add as new evidence came in. Then Joe's parents showed up with a whole team of expensive lawyers who immediately started attacking Courtney's credibility. They filed motions claiming she was making everything up for attention and money, that she had a history of mental illness Joe had never mentioned, that the whole thing was an elaborate scheme to get divorced and take his money. They even suggested Courtney had drugged herself and planted the evidence. It made me so angry I wanted to scream at them in court, but Renata told us to stay calm and let the evidence speak. That's when we discovered Joe had been laying groundwork for this defense for months. His coworkers started coming forward after seeing the news, telling Gregory that Joe had been talking about Courtney's supposed mental problems since last year. He'd told them she was paranoid, making up stories about being followed, accusing him of things that never happened. One coworker said Joe had seemed genuinely worried about his wife's mental state, even asking for recommendations for psychiatrists. Another said Joe had mentioned Courtney might hurt herself, and he was scared to leave her alone. It was all lies, but Joe had been so convincing that several coworkers had offered to testify as character witnesses for him before learning the truth. The financial investigation revealed even worse plans. Joe had been moving money to offshore accounts for 2 years, small amounts that wouldn't trigger reports, but adding up to almost $300,000. The investigators found evidence he'd been researching countries without extradition treaties, looking at property listings in Southeast Asia, even learning basic phrases in Thai and Vietnamese. He'd never planned to stay with Courtney long-term, just use her for the insurance money then disappear. The preliminary hearing was brutal to watch. Courtney had to sit in the same room as Joe while she identified each medication from the safe, explaining what she remembered about taking them without knowing what they were. She broke down describing how she'd wake up sore and confused, how Joe would tell her they'd been intimate but she never remembered it, how she'd trusted him completely because he was her husband. Even the judge looked disturbed when Courtney described the physical pain of the miscarriages, not knowing they were being caused by someone who claimed to love her. Joe's defense team tried everything to get the wire recording thrown out. They argued it was obtained illegally, that I'd coerced Courtney into wearing it, that Joe had an expectation of privacy in his own home. The judge listened to their arguments for hours, then ruled the recording was admissible because Courtney had consented to wear the wire, and she had every right to record in her own bedroom. The defense lawyers looked furious but couldn't argue with the judge's reasoning. The worst discovery came when Gregory's team analyzed Joe's computer more thoroughly. They found he'd been researching lethal doses of the abortion medication, looking up how much would cause hemorrhaging versus how much would be fatal. His search history showed he'd been calculating Courtney's weight and adjusting doses, planning to increase them for the 5th cycle. Gregory told us Joe had probably been planning to kill Courtney and make it look like a pregnancy complication, collecting both the baby's life insurance and hers. Courtney's parents flew in 2 days later from Ohio after I called them with the full story. Her mom kept crying and saying she should have known something was wrong when Joe always insisted on handling everything medical himself. Her dad just sat there with his fists clenched while looking at the photos we'd taken of the safe contents. They moved into a hotel near my apartment to be close to Courtney, who was still staying with me. The local news somehow got wind of the story and started calling it the worst case of reproductive coercion in state history. Reporters kept showing up at my apartment building trying to get interviews, but Courtney couldn't handle talking to them. Gregory had to station an officer outside to keep the media away while we tried to figure out our next steps. 3 other women reached out to the prosecutor's office after seeing the news coverage. One said her ex-boyfriend had done something similar with fertility drugs, but she'd never been able to prove it. Another woman from 2 states over said she'd lost 5 pregnancies at exactly the same timing and was now wondering if her husband was involved. The third was Joe's college girlfriend, who said he'd always been obsessed with pregnancy and insurance money even back then. Renata called us with updates every few days as more evidence came in. Joe's lawyer was trying to build an insanity defense and requested a full psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatrist spent 6 hours with Joe over 2 sessions and concluded he showed narcissistic personality traits but was completely sane and aware of his actions. He knew exactly what he was doing and why, which made the insanity defense impossible. Renata offered Joe a plea deal of 15 years in prison if he'd admit to everything and save Courtney from having to testify. Joe turned it down flat and told his lawyer he could convince any jury that Courtney was making it all up for attention. His arrogance was so extreme that even his own lawyer seemed frustrated during the meetings, Gregory observed. During the discovery process, Gregory's team found something even worse in Joe's computer files. He had journal entries going back 5 years before he even met Courtney, where he'd planned out exactly how to execute this scheme. He'd researched which drugs to use and at what doses, and how to time everything for maximum insurance payouts. He'd even calculated how many cycles he could put someone through before it would kill them. The entries were so detailed and cold that Gregory said even the other detectives were disturbed reading them. Courtney made the decision to testify at trial even though she was terrified of facing Joe in court. She told Renata that other women needed to know they weren't alone and that these predators could be stopped. Esme arranged for special security measures during the trial, including a separate entrance for Courtney and screens so she wouldn't have to look directly at Joe while testifying. The trial date got set for 3 months out, which felt like forever to wait. Courtney had good days where she seemed almost normal and bad days where she couldn't get out of bed. She started seeing a trauma therapist twice a week who specialized in cases like this. I went with her to most appointments just to sit in the waiting room so she'd know I was there. About 6 weeks before trial, Joe tried to contact Courtney through his cousin, who showed up at my apartment. The cousin said Joe would sign over the house and all their assets if Courtney would just drop the charges and let him move on with his life. I recorded the whole conversation on my phone while Courtney hid in the bedroom shaking. Gregory added witness tampering to the charges, and the judge revoked Joe's bail immediately. With Joe finally in jail awaiting trial, Courtney started sleeping through the night for the first time in months. She was still jumpy whenever someone knocked on the door and couldn't go anywhere alone, but at least she didn't have to worry about Joe showing up anymore. Her parents rented an apartment in town so they could stay close during the trial preparation. Her mom cooked all of Courtney's favorite foods from childhood, trying to help her feel safe again. We spent hours going over Courtney's testimony with Renata, making sure every detail was documented. Courtney would have to describe the most intimate violations of her body and trust in front of strangers, which made her physically sick to think about. But she kept saying she had to do it for the other women who might be going through the same thing. The media attention got worse as the trial date approached, with some outlets trying to paint Joe as a victim of false accusations. His parents went on one news show claiming Courtney had mental health issues and was making everything up for money. Gregory had to release some of the evidence publicly, just to counter their lies, which meant everyone knew the horrible details of what Joe had done. Courtney stopped leaving the apartment at all because people recognized her from the news coverage. Some were supportive, but others would stare or whisper, which made her feel exposed and vulnerable all over again. I took a leave of absence from work to stay with her full-time as the trial got closer. Trial day finally came, and the courthouse was packed with reporters trying to get photos of us walking in. Esme had arranged for us to enter through a side door with security guards blocking the cameras while Courtney gripped my hand, so tight I thought she might break my fingers. The courtroom felt cold and sterile with Joe sitting at the defense table in a suit looking like the perfect husband he'd pretended to be for years. Courtney had to testify for 3 hours describing every detail of waking up sore and confused after the drugged tea while Joe stared at her with this blank expression that made my skin crawl. The prosecutor played the wire recording, and you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom when Joe's voice came through, checking if Courtney was unconscious before preparing the syringe. His lawyer tried to argue entrapment, but the judge shut that down fast, saying a wife had every right to record in her own home. When the jury came back after just 2 hours of deliberation with guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, Courtney collapsed against me, sobbing with relief. The judge sentenced Joe to 25 years and added 5 more for witness tampering when they found out about him trying to contact Courtney through his cousin. After it was all over, I took time off work to help Courtney move into a new apartment across town where Joe's family wouldn't know the address. We spent weeks installing security cameras and new locks and setting up routines that made her feel safe, like always parking in well-lit spots and having neighbors check in if they didn't see her for a day. 6 months passed, and Courtney was doing so much better with therapy twice a week in a support group for domestic violence survivors. She even started seeing someone new, this guy from her therapy group whose ex-wife had done similar things with poisoning his food to make him sick. They took things super slow, and he understood when she needed space or got triggered by certain things, like someone bringing her tea without her asking. The foundation she started with some of the restitution money was already helping dozens of women get out of bad situations and find lawyers who would actually listen to them. She turned all that pain into something that could help others, though she still had days where she couldn't get out of bed, and that was okay too. I went back to work but started asking different questions during patient exams and caught 3 cases of abuse I might have missed before, including one woman whose husband was messing with her birth control pills. Courtney and I met up every month for dinner where we could talk about everything without judgment, and she said having someone who saw it all happen made her feel less crazy when the trauma tried to convince her it wasn't that bad. Joe filed an appeal claiming ineffective counsel, but the appeals court denied it, saying the evidence was overwhelming, and his lawyer had done everything possible with an impossible case. A year after everything started, Courtney decided she wanted to be a mom, but on her own terms, so she started the adoption process. The agency was amazing and understood her situation and didn't judge her for what she'd been through. She got matched with this 4-year-old girl named Cora, whose birth parents had lost custody due to neglect, and who needed someone patient and understanding. Watching Courtney with Cora was beautiful because she was so gentle and never pushed when Cora needed space, and they built trust slowly with art therapy and baking cookies together. The adoption finalized on this sunny Tuesday morning with me and Courtney's parents and Esme all there in the judge's chambers cheering when he signed the papers. Courtney held Cora and cried happy tears, and Cora, who usually didn't like being touched much, wrapped her little arms around Courtney's neck and whispered something that made Courtney cry even harder. 2 years went by, and Cora was doing amazing in their little house with a garden where they grew tomatoes and had tea parties with stuffed animals instead of real tea, which Courtney still couldn't drink. They had Friday movie nights and Saturday library trips and Sunday pancakes that Cora helped make while standing on a stool to reach the counter. Cora started calling Courtney Mama after 6 months and slept through the night without nightmares more often than not, and even made friends at her new school. The house was full of Cora's artwork and photos from their adventures to the zoo and the beach and the mountains where they went camping in a cabin, not a tent, because Courtney wanted solid doors between them and the outside world. Joe was serving his time in a prison 3 states away and would be in his 60s when he got out if he even lived that long, since apparently other inmates didn't like men who hurt women and kids. Courtney's foundation had grown into this whole network with chapters in 5 cities, and she testified at the state legislature about reproductive coercion, which helped pass a new law making it a specific crime. Sometimes I watched her at these events speaking to rooms full of people about recognizing the signs and getting help, and I couldn't believe this was the same woman who'd been so broken just 2 years ago. She wasn't the same person really, because trauma changes you, but she'd built something new and strong from the pieces, and that was its own kind of beautiful. One Thursday at the foundation office, Courtney was working with a new client when I stopped by to drop off lunch, and noticed how she kept glancing at this woman who was filling out intake forms in the waiting area. The woman had that same haunted look we'd seen so many times, but there was something else too, a quiet strength that reminded me of Courtney after she'd started healing. They ended up talking for 3 hours that first meeting, and then the woman started coming to the support group Courtney ran on Wednesdays, and pretty soon they were getting coffee after meetings and texting constantly. Cora loved her immediately, which was huge since Cora was still careful about new people, and would actually run up and hug this woman whenever she came over. 6 months passed, and I watched them build something real and solid with no rushing and lots of patience and understanding about triggers and bad days. The woman moved in after a year, and they turned the spare bedroom into her art studio, where she painted these abstract pieces that somehow captured healing without being cheesy about it. They got married the next spring in Courtney's backyard, with just 20 people there, and Cora wore this purple dress she'd picked out herself, and threw flower petals everywhere, including on the cake, which made everyone laugh. The ceremony lasted maybe 10 minutes, and then we all ate barbecue and danced to music from someone's phone hooked up to speakers. By then, the foundation had chapters in 12 cities, and Courtney was flying to DC to testify before Congress about reproductive coercion laws, and getting calls from prosecutors asking her to be an expert witness. I went with her to this huge conference in Chicago, where she spoke to 800 people about recognizing control patterns, and the whole room was silent except for some crying. She wore this blue suit and stood at that podium like she'd been doing it her whole life, even though I knew she'd thrown up from nerves right before going on stage. The transformation was incredible to watch because this was someone who'd been so broken she couldn't get out of bed, and now she was changing laws and saving lives. Time kept moving, and they adopted another kid, a 7-year-old boy who'd been in foster care since he was 3 and had his own trauma to work through. Their house turned into this chaotic, wonderful place with art supplies everywhere, and 2 dogs they'd rescued, and a vegetable garden that the kids helped tend. We still met for coffee every Thursday morning at the same place we'd been going for years, and now we talked about normal stuff like how Cora was doing in the school, and whether they should get chickens and where to go for summer vacation. The trauma was still there underneath everything, but it didn't control our conversations anymore, and sometimes we'd go weeks without mentioning Joe or the trial or any of it. At Courtney's 40th birthday party, her backyard was full of people she'd helped and friends from the foundation, and her parents who'd moved closer to help with the kids. She pulled me aside while everyone was eating cake and hugged me tight and thanked me for believing her that first day when she showed me those marks on her arm. I reminded her that she was the one who had the courage to fight back and gather evidence and face him in court when it would have been easier to run. Later that night, I watched her dancing with Cora and her son to some pop song I didn't recognize, and her partner was taking pictures and laughing at their terrible dance moves. The fairy lights they'd strung up made everything glow, and Courtney was spinning Cora around while her son did some kind of robot dance that made no sense with the music. She caught my eye and smiled this huge real smile that reached her eyes in a way I hadn't seen in those dark early days. Here was someone who'd been systematically tortured and broken down to nothing, but she'd rebuilt herself into something even stronger than before. Every single day, she chose to get up and make breakfast and help with homework and run the foundation, and love her family was another victory over what Joe tried to do to her. He'd wanted to destroy her for money, but instead she'd built this whole life full of meaning and purpose and joy that had nothing to do with him. Well, folks, that's it from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw my thoughts and questions out there along the way. I really appreciate it. Like the video, it helps more than you think.